by black bloc, black shirt rioters from Antifa. So joining me now is MrAndyNgo, editor-at-large of the Post-Millennial, who's been covering the violence across the US. Welcome, Andy, and thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Now, let me start with this. You've been covering the situation with the riots across the United States. New data has been released that demonstrates that public approval for Black Lives Matter nosedived since June from net plus 25 now to 0. Among whites, it dropped from plus 22 to minus 5. And these data are before the riots in Kenosha in Wisconsin. What is your view as to explaining why this support for BLM is plunging in the way it is in the polls?
Well, from what's becoming clear if you pay attention to footage recorded by citizen journalists and independent journalists, and is that at these so-called peaceful protests, when there are outbreaks of violence, you will see the mantra of Black Lives Matter being uttered and or sprayed as things are being vandalized or looted. And I think people are waking up and seeing that while the slogan sounds noble and benign, behind it is a movement, an ideology, an organized movement that is working to systematically dismantle the rule of law in America. And they're doing that by attacking our institutions that uphold the law.
Now, last night, a Trump supporter was killed in Portland. You've uploaded a video that shows apparent BLM activists celebrating the killing of this Trump supporter by saying they clean the rubbish of their own home. On top of that, Mayor Ted Wheeler has published an open letter to President Trump refusing to allow federal troops into this city. Why are the Democratic authorities not clamping down on the lawless zone and on the rioting at nighttime and now killings as well?
So what your listeners need to be aware of is that in the U.S., as part of the federalist system, there is a lot of autonomy that are afforded to states and local governments. And in some instances, the federal government may send in federal law enforcement, for example, to protect federal property, as happened in Portland when rioters tried to burn down a federal courthouse. But when those officers were sent in July, that caused thousands of people to come out, and use in all these headlines across our mainstream media was that this is a foreign occupying force, that these were Trump stormtroopers. And so I think it's wise for Trump now to really put the ball in the court of the mayor of the city and the governor of the state to decide if they want outside assistance. And if they don't, well, it's on them. And within less than 48 hours of Wheeler sending out that very bitter and spiteful letter rejecting help, well, a person was killed in downtown Portland in what looks like a politically motivated attack.
I'm going to read parts of the letter and then have you respond to it because, again, the listeners may not be aware of this letter. This is a letter sent by the mayor of Portland where this lawless zone currently exists, where Black Shirt Street, let's call them activists, but there are riots going on, have taken over parts of the city, and the Democratic city, I must say. The mayor was offered help, and he responded in a surprisingly worded letter. He said, "Dear President Trump, yet again, you said you offered to aid Portland by sending in federal law enforcement to our city. On behalf of the city of Portland, no thanks." That's where it stops being polite. And it continues, "We don't need your policies of division and demagoguery." This is from an official mayor of a city. It's astonishing. "Portlanders are on to you. We have already seen your reckless disregard for human life in your bumbling response to COVID pandemic, and we know you've reached the conclusion that images of violence or vandalism are your only ticket to re-election. There is no place for looting, arson or vandalism in our city. There is no room here for racist violence or those who wish to bring their ideology of hate into our community. Those who commit criminal acts will be apprehended and persecuted under the law." The letter continues, but I just wanted to ask you for your specific reaction I'll read one more paragraph to you. It says, when you send the feds to Portland last month, you made the situation far worse. Your offer to repeat that disaster is a cynical attempt to stoke fear and distract us from the real work of our city. It's a very harsh letter to the president, but as you've said, not only have people seen the images of the riots in Portland, after this letter was sent, somebody was killed who was a Trump supporter, chased down in the street by other rioters and murdered. Has there been much of a reaction to that post this letter being sent in that way?
Well, this is him just, making a political statement of his own. He's up for re-election in Portland, Oregon, in the northwest of the United States, is a very left-wing city, and by left I mean it's more to the left than the mainstream Democrat Party. So you have this political monoculture that really tolerates and accepts this sort of excesses of the far left, which is why we're nearing now 100 days of straight violent protests and riots in the city. And it's really sounds unbelievable and surreal. And we have somebody who's dead now. In response to one particular part of the letter, he said that those responsible will be investigated and prosecuted. Well, that's not true. Our prosecutor for the county, who is a political figure, elected political figure, has already made it his office's official policy that there's a whole list of crimes that they won't pursue, and that will include things such as felony riot, vandalism, resisting arrest, attempting escape. So, yeah, as part of some of the journalist work that I do, is that I'm documenting the people who are being arrested and charged every day in Portland, and many of them are within 24 hours back out rioting because there's literally no consequence.
Help me understand this. When these people who are rioting criminals, when they're arrested, who's paying their bail?
So the overwhelming majority of them are released without bail for a number of reasons. One, because of our county jails have enacted these policies in response to COVID that they're only holding the most egregious of charges, and there have been some of them who are charged with some of the rioters who are accused of things such as stabbing somebody or seriously injuring law enforcement. And those people are quickly their bail is paid by activist organizations who I call them Antifa bail funds, in that they acting as sort of front groups on GoFundMe to raise bail for people accused of violent crimes. And that's a
Wow.
way of them to sort of circumvent the policies of these mainstream fundraising platforms.
Wow. And that's legal?
Unfortunately, yes.
You're saying there are people that have attacked police officers, stabbed people, and there are crowdfunding campaigns to have them bailed so they can continue causing trouble in the riots on the streets at night?
Through charity groups, yes.
Wow. Final question for you, Mr. No, and thank you for joining me. How does it all affect the presidential election, and do you think this affects Trump more or Biden more?
I think we're starting to see now that the riots have been going on in different cities for months and months. I think it's starting to push moderate Democrats to a position of where they're seeing that Mr. Biden is just not somebody who has the ability to lead the country through such turmoil, because you can look to what Democrat leaders are doing at the local level, and they have no control of it. So logic would suggest that, taken to the executive level, it would be just a repeat of what they're already doing at the state level, which is to tolerate and excuse violent rioting because it's done in the so-called name of racial justice. And that's what's sick and insidious about all of this, is that they're burning, killing, and looting in the name of justice.
And to make it clear to all listeners, you yourself come from a migrant family and are Asian American. For you, this is nothing to do with white supremacy. You're making a point that you want people to adhere to the rule of law. Thank you very much for joining us. NrAndyNgo, editor-at-large of the Post Millennial, who's been covering the violence